Hello everyone, this is Tristan here, otherwise known as TZLongsword, and I'm with...
Cory Winslow of the Medieval European Martial Arts Guild.
Well, Cory's been a good friend of mine for a few years now, and he's visiting me here in our very own Squinting Rabbit studios, so we just thought we'd sit down and have a chat about longsword. So, I know this has been kind of a debate that's raged for many years, especially on the internets. When people talk about frog DNA and, pulling from multiple sources, not only, the European ones, but from wherever they might have experience. So I was just curious what you think about the difference between a bottom-up approach to understanding source materials as opposed to a top-down approach. How I consider this is essentially a bottom-up approach is just starting at face value with a particular manuscript, textbook or whatever, and kind of taking it from that one source and building up. I think back when you began with MEMAG, I think this was kind of your approach too. And to contrast that with, I tend to have what I consider a little bit more of a top-down approach, where I, obviously, looking at the sources and looking at the individual techniques, I have a sense for what we're trying to accomplish with each individual technique. But rather than trying to look at every single word, every little nuance, is I try to almost retro-engineer it, just given ideas about body mechanics, about physics, psychology, and things like that, and try to find something that matches the text almost accidentally, I suppose. And throughout the community, I think there's a healthy mix of both approaches, but I'm just wondering what you think is not necessarily a better approach, but the value in either, I suppose, or the pitfalls of either.
Yeah, I think if you examine the source material, not really drawing from other martial arts, you can potentially get more, I don't want to say pure, but pure interpretations of various things. The pitfall, of course, is that you don't know what you're talking about because you don't have other source material from which to draw. So I think that there's a large danger of contaminating your views and finding solutions to problems that don't necessarily exist in your source material, bringing them in from other sources. Whereas if you just stayed consistent within your source material, you could potentially find those solutions within the source material because you're not tempted by other systems, looking in them to find them there. So I think you can definitely get deeper if you stick to one type of source or one particular source, but you also are kind of myopic because you can't see the bigger picture. So I think there needs to be a balance, but finding that particular balance is quite difficult to accomplish.
It's interesting you use the word temptation, actually, because I was immediately thinking of the biblical interpretation over the years, not just of Judeo-Christian kind of sources, but let's look at the Middle Ages, and again at our source material we have these glosses, and this is not just a phenomenon in the Fechtbooker, but this is just an approach to literature, shall we say, of reading and distilling and interpreting things, and then rewriting basically almost like a thesis or your own views on it. But also I think, and again I agree that there has to be some sort of healthy mix, but staying almost too true, almost too heavily focused on one particular thing could very well also go off into weird tangents, just based on, for example, linguistic interpretation. We don't necessarily know all the nuances in the dialects that these are written on. We don't have the kind of context. There could be puns, for example. There could be deeper meaning behind these words that we just don't have, that could otherwise color our understanding of the sources. So I suppose that's been my hesitation in not taking that purist approach, is that I am not fluent in, you know, the Middle High German or the new early, what is it, new early German,
New High German,
early New High German dialect. So I can't say for certain, you know, what these are. I kind of start mostly from an English standpoint. Actually, mostly that's because of you and your translation work. But we're already layers of interpretation in, so it can kind of frost the lens a little bit, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, when you stick with one source, you can go so deep. You can find pretty much whatever you look for. So if you don't have kind of a grounding in other sources to keep your head above water, you can just get lost. There are so many examples of that with my own previous past interpretations that are just completely wrong. But the upside to that is when you try all of these ridiculous things, by process of elimination, you sometimes do, you know, end up at the more correct conclusion. And if you don't stick with a particular source, you'll never get that crazy. Because you can substitute, you know, what the solution to the problem that you're looking for with something else. So you may never actually find out what the source tells you the solution is because you found it somewhere else. So you just don't need to. You already fill that obligation.
That can also be a problem too, again, looking at some of the early KDF sources that make a very clear assumption that the intended audience is already someone who has some sort of schooling in you know, in wrestling and in horsemanship and things of that nature. So there are already gaps that are presented even in the first, you know, few folia of the sources that we have to deal with. It's like, well, here's, you know, step 2 begins soon. Yeah. Without those fundamentals.
And the thing is, we're not even clear on that, even if that was the case, because Jockey Meyer writes that he's writing his manual because the art has fallen out of practice with youths. So he is writing the fundamentals, but still so much is missing from his art, distance and timing and management of these things, that we still don't have enough information to really fill in the gaps, if they were ever filled in to begin with.
One thing that's always been interesting, we've gone back since, I think it's 2008, 2009, right? And over the years, I've always found it fascinating how, despite the differences in our approach, including Mike Edelson in this as well, that over the years, our interpretations of a lot of these techniques have ended up being the same or very, very similar, despite kind of different meandering paths that we've each individually taken to get there. It's always been kind of fascinating how, you know, I remember that one year we were arguing for, 4 hours about, you know, Krumpau, when we finally realized that, oh yeah, we both meant the same thing. We were just taking it from 2 completely different directions.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the truth will out, hopefully. At least that's what we're trying to, you know, work with. Yeah, we just came to the same thing from different angles. And honestly, most of the times we've disagreed on things, it's not necessarily because what you thought didn't work, but it's possibly because the texts say something that doesn't really actually make sense. So we weren't disagreeing in what's right, we were disagreeing in what the text necessarily says. But generally, we would come to the same conclusions on things that do actually apply to both working in reality and according to the text.
Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. If you haven't already, you can subscribe to both of us on our YouTube channels. And if you really like what you see, please feel free to join us on our Patreon accounts as well.